Hi everybody, I'm Joe. Thanks for joining me today. I'm here with a replay against Affinity. Looking at the opening hands, we see that I have two non-island blue sources, which is great to see in the opening hand because against the mirror match, if we're playing against Merfolk, we can keep them off of Islandwalk, which many times can swing a game in our favor, even if we have things like the Bad Lord who makes all of the opponent's creatures big as well. One of the most important things in the matchup is keeping the opponent off Islandwalk if possible. So very happy to see these two lands in my opener. And then, of course, AEther Vial into my three Merfolk. Silvergill will draw me a card. Spreading Seas can screw the opponent's mana and also draw me cards. So excellent Merfolk hand over here. On the opponent's side, we see they've got also two lands, and then looks like 4 creatures and cranial plating. So almost certainly a keep. The only thing that's lacking is fast mana. We see that they just have the 2 lands. There's no Mox Opals, there's no Springleaf Drums, so they're not going to be rushing everything out. We'll probably see Blink Moth, Ornithopter, Memnite on turn 1, and then turn 2, we'll see a follow-up of Cranial Plating or probably Steel Overseer to start making his creatures bigger little by little. Etch Champion is great in the matchup, but we see the opponent doesn't even have access to 3 mana right now, so he might not even get to come into play. So I think 2 keeps. The opponent won the die roll, so that makes his lack of fast mana a little more acceptable. He's going to have a little more time to develop. So as I said, land and 2 0 drops. I drew into a second Islandwalk Lord, which is very strong. I'll open with Oboro into AEther Vial. Pass back to the opponent, and they drew an Arcbound Ravager. Probably not what they wanted to see. They've already got these payoff cards in their hand. Opponent's going to get in for 1, and then second main, cast a Steel Overseer. So for my turn, upkeep, I'm going to put the AEther Vial onto 1. And Harbinger is a fantastic draw in this matchup, especially with AEther Vial on the table. We see the opponent has Cranial Plating, so what they do with that card, is they stack, they equip it to, a flying creature and try to get in for massive chunks of damage and just close the game out in a couple of turns. With AEther Vial and Harbinger, we can set them back at least an entire turn by getting that big creature off the table. And more important than just bouncing a creature is we disrupt their plan, right? I mean, if we have no interaction at all, then they just get to do whatever they want. They see the cards in their hand, they see what I'm doing, they can go right over the top with flying creatures, and they start to calculate damage and figure out what their clock is, 2 turns, 3 turns, whatever. If I disrupt that, a lot of times I think an opponent playing a deck like Affinity isn't even really doing math on the toughness, the power of my creatures. So sometimes can get surprise wins with surprise interaction like Harbinger of the Tides. So I'm going to play my second land here and get Silvergill out. I'm going to reveal Lord of Atlantis and drew Kira. I'll pause again for a second. Kira is a sort of subtly great card in this matchup. We don't want Kira for the normal reason against Affinity. We don't really care about all of her text. We don't care that our creatures have, whenever this creature becomes target of a spell, counter it or whatever. We care about just that one word, about flying. Because, as I just mentioned, we can interact on the ground. We can make very careful blocks and trades. But if the opponent's going over the top with a massive flyer, the only thing we can do about that is Vapor Snag, Echoing Truth, or Harbinger, or Kira. So Kira and Harbinger, great running draws there, which give me a little bit of interaction in a matchup where we definitely need some kind of interaction. So we see the Cranial Plating coming out, getting equipped. We see how clunky Affinity can be without access to their fast mana. Just 3 lands, tapping out to play 1 piece of equipment. It is pretty powerful, though. The opponent's going to activate Steel Overseer. Memnite becomes a 2/2. Ornithopter becomes a 1/3. With 4 artifacts on the table, the Ornithopter's attacking as a 5/3 in the air. So looks like I'm taking 5, but the opponent says 7. I ask why, and I think he just forgot to tap the Memnite. So taps the Memnite. I'm not going to trade my Silvergill right now. So it takes 7, which is an enormous chunk of damage. But as I've mentioned now, well, hold on. On the end step, I activate Aether Vial, bringing Cursecatcher. I was saying, as I mentioned earlier, Aether Vial is going to get to go up to 2 now, and Harbinger will give me more interaction on the opponent's next attack step. So hopefully I won't be taking as large chunks of damage moving forward. Aether Vial goes up to 2. I draw Master of Waves. This guy is usually too slow for the matchup. The game's usually closing out by turn 4, so if I tap out for Master of Waves, the opponent just attacks and kills me. So at this point, I'm going to use my 2 mana to play a Lord of Atlantis and just swing for 5. If I brought in the other Lord of Atlantis right now, I could be swinging for 7, but we really need this Aether Vial up for Harbinger. I'm going to choose to wait until the opponent's attack step, declare attacker's step, before using Harbinger. If I were to do it on my turn, he could then re-equip Cranial Plating to one of his other creatures, like activate a Blink Moth, and then attach Cranial Plating to the Blink Moth. So we don't want to reveal anything more than we have to. Better against this specific deck to leave Harbinger up for the opponent's turn. Against Infect, the opposite would be true, because Infect runs spells that give their creatures hexproof. So if we wait until their attack step to try to bounce their creatures with Harbinger, in response to Harbinger's ability, they can play, I think the new card is called Blossoming Defense, but then of course they always have Vines of Vastwood and Apostle's Blessing to protect their creatures from Harbinger. So we would want to do this on our turn if we were playing against Infect, but we're certainly going to wait until the opponent's turn on Affinity, since they don't have any room in their deck for protection effects. They just try to push as much damage as possible, and we get to capitalize on that by interacting with their creatures on their turn. The opponent drew a land, plays it out, and looks like they're going to activate both Blink Moth Nexi, taking advantage of Steel Overseer's ability, which will put +1 counters on those guys as well as his other 2 creatures. Opponent temporarily moves Cranial Plating to get the counters onto his creatures, and then is going to put it back on top of the Ornithopter. If we count up the artifacts now, it looks like he's got 6. So Ornithopter as a 2/4 now, getting +6/+0, is actually attacking in the air as an 8/4. And then we've got 2 and 2, so 8+2+2 is actually exactly lethal in the air. So you can see exactly how valuable the Harbinger is in this situation. So I go ahead and activate Aether Vial. I'm going to bounce the Ornithopter. That takes 8 damage out of the situation. And then I thought for a moment about whether I want to block the Memnite and trade, since my Harbinger is a 3/3 because of the Lord of Atlantis, and Memnite with the 2 counters from Steel Overseer is a 3/3. However, with the opponent at 15, we're going to need a lot of bodies to push enough damage. So doing some math, we see that right now I've got 2 and 2 and 3 and 3. So I believe that's 10. 2 + 3 is 5. 3 + 2 is 5. That's 10. If I play another Lord, that becomes 3, 3, 3. That's 9 + 8 is 17. So that would actually, just with this Lord alone, would give me lethal on board, and I do have the Spreading Seas in hand. I've got the Kira, and the Aether Vial will be able to go up to 3, so I can have some sort of surprise blocks for the opponent's next attack. So at this point, I think it's probably the right call to not be overly concerned with the opponent's ground attack. I mean, we can easily just die to the air. So we're going to let the Memnite come through right now, and possibly just leave up a couple of blockers next turn in case the opponent decides to get in with Memnite again. So at this point, it's just 2, 2, and 3. So I'm going to take 7 and go down to 5. So with Aether Vial on 2 and a Lord in hand and 2 mana available for Spreading Seas, it seems enticing to leave Aether Vial on 2 just to get the Lord onto the table and use my mana for the Spreading Seas. But we really want to surprise the opponent with Kira during the attack step. So Aether Vial, unfortunately, has to go up to 3 here. Also seems like since I have the Master of Waves, in another matchup, going up to 3 would be great because then I can follow up with 4, but this game is not going to last more than another turn. So Master of Waves, not even relevant with the Aether Vial on the table here. So I drew into a land. Not great in the situation, given what my objective is. Spreading Seas can wait, because with 2 Lords on the table, we can sort of surprise Islandwalk. And as I mentioned, we'll be establishing, I think, 17 damage on the board with the second Lord. So I play the Wanderwine Hub and cast Lord of Atlantis. And at 5 life, and with the opponent having access to 3 flyers, I decide this turn to sort of respect his attacks quite a lot and not push too much damage this turn. I don't want him to be able to profitably attack next turn with Steel Overseer and Memnite and Ornithopter and the Blink Moths. If he draws another land, he can activate both and attach Cranial Plating to something. So after thinking for a little bit, I just decide to get in with the Silvergill Adept. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that the way that Affinity players tend to think, especially against a deck like Merfolk, which doesn't really play flyers, they just sort of figure out their combat math with their flyers and cranial plating, and if they've got lethal established, they're just going to follow that line a lot of the time. And in this case, I think that that's what happened. So we're going to see the opponent actually just chump with an Ornithopter, which is a little bit rare. It seems like maybe the opponent is respecting the power of Merfolk to attack for enormous chunks of damage. And if he actually did the math and saw that I had 17, maybe he's just trying to prevent a little bit of damage where he can. I do have blue up for a Vapor Snag, so he thinks maybe he might get slowed down next turn, and if I don't have Islandwalk, maybe I need to attack next turn and he can leave up a Memnite to save some damage. So showing some respect with the block with the Ornithopter, not taking the 4 damage. I think the opponent sees his line. He's going to attach Cranial Plating to something. Actually, even just with Steel Overseer making these Blink Moths bigger, he's going to be attacking for 6 in the air. So probably enough by itself. I'm going to pass here. Blue up, representing Vapor Snag, and 3 up for the Cura that I very thankfully have in hand. Looks like the opponent drew another Cranial Plating. Not amazing. But fairly quickly, the opponent just activates his 2 Blink Moths and is going to turn them sideways. Those are his only attackers. He chooses, as I mentioned, actually, to leave Memnite up, respecting my interaction. So if I were to have Vapor Snag here, bounce one of his guys, he has Memnite up for a block next turn. If I attack for the 17 that I mentioned, he can make his Memnite into a 4/4 with Steel Overseer. And, well, he will be doing that right now anyway, because he's going to be going for lethal here, I think. The Memnite will be a 4/4, and he can sort of eat a Cursecatcher and then only take 4 + 4 + 3 + 3, which is 8 + 6, which is 14, leaving him at 1, getting to attack with his flyers again. So very clever play by the opponent, playing around Vapor Snag by leaving up Memnite as a potential blocker. Actually, I'm sorry, that's incorrect because Vapor Snag does 1 point of damage. So if he would actually need to block and trade, I guess, with like a Harbinger or a Silvergill next turn. That way he'd only be taking 3, 3, 3, and 4, which is 13 plus the 1 from the Vapor Snag, which would be 14. Right, but he could still live. So it still is pretty clever playing around Vapor Snag. He would just not be able to block the Cursecatcher. He'd have to block, or a Lord, he'd have to block the bigger guys. Unfortunately for him, I have the Spreading Seas in hand. So here comes Kira. She's going to be a hero and block one of these flyers to prevent lethal damage. Opponent's going to activate Steel Overseer, and I'm going to take 3 from one of those Blink Moth Nexus. Nexi. Kira bites the dust, and it doesn't really matter what I draw at this point. Drew a Harbinger is pretty good, but unnecessary. Have the Spreading Seas in hand, and as I've been calculating for the last few turns, I've got 3, 3, 3, 4, and 4, which is, again, 9 plus 8, which is 17. Everybody with Islandwalk, including the Lords, since I've got 2 of them, and icing on the cake, I drew the Vapor Snag I was just mentioning. So opponent scooped it up. Very interesting game 1, and we'll move right along to game 2. Alright, so the opponent's going to be on the play again. We see he has Spell Pierce in the deck after sideboarding, which is strange. I mean, it's possible this is in the main deck and he didn't take it out, but Merfolk doesn't have a lot of targets for Spell Pierce. I happen to have one of the few targets in hand. I guess he's thinking playing around Vapor Snag, playing around Echoing Truth, playing around, I guess, Hurkyl's Recall. So maybe Spell Pierce is smart if he's got the blue mana in the deck. Looking at the opening hands, we see the Island and a Glimmer Void. Again, no fast mana, but he does have a Spell Pierce and the blue mana. Signal Pest, Etch Champion, and Cranial Plating for sort of big damage and evasion. Probably a keep on the opponent's side. And this is one of those hands that I like to use as examples of why Merfolk is, let's see, in certain senses, a little more robust when it comes to mulligans than some other decks, like Jund, which plays 3 colors and needs to have a certain combination of those colors in their opening hand. This hand with 2 Mutavaults and an AEther Vial is certainly keepable. We definitely want to hit a blue source or 2 along the way, but not optimal. We'd really love to have one of these Mutavaults be blue, but it's definitely not a mulligan. And, we'll see how it plays out. The opponent, as I mentioned, kept, and being on the play, opens with Glimmer Void, Signal Pest, Ornithopter, and no fast mana, so they just pass. Now, in this game, what I was hoping to see was a slow start, and this is such a slow start. We don't want them to be attacking for 10 lifelink damage on turn 2 or something like that when we have a pretty slow hand like this. So for my turn, I drew another AEther Vial, which is a little bit clunky, but at the same time, not terrible, because I can't do much with my colorless mana, and AEther Vial is, one of the few things I can. So it's slow on my side as well, but eventually we'll be able to catch up with the tempo that AEther Vial gives me. The opponent drew a Ghost Quarter and plays the Ghost Quarter, taps the 2 to get Cranial Plating on the board, and is just going to attack for 1 with the Battle Cry, pumping the Ornithopter. Alright, I go for 20 down to 19. Pretty safe attack for the opponent there since I have no creatures on the board. Drew an Islandwalk Lord. Always happy to see those guys, but as I mentioned already, a very slow start on my side of the table. It's going to take a while to actually get my hand unpacked and out onto the board. To pass back to the opponent, and see he drew another land. Not amazing, but it is an artifact that contributes to Cranial Plating. Looks like the opponent is just going to get in for another 1 point of damage. I think he feels very unthreatened by my current board. So he's going to take the opportunity to develop his own board and get this Etched Champion out. Cranial Plating wouldn't be doing a huge buff right now if he chose instead to just activate Cranial Plating. Ornithopter, instead of swinging for 1, would be swinging for 5, which is quite a lot. But with Cranial Plating out on the board, Etched Champion is a pretty good call. But my board state actually does interact with this guy, since I have the 2 Mutavaults. Mutavault can block Etched Champion, but we see a very unique sort of board all around because the opponent has interaction for my Mutavault. He has a Ghost Quarter. So if I activate a Mutavault to block Etched Champion, he'll be able to Ghost Quarter my Mutavault before I get to the block step and still get in with the Etched Champion. Of course, I do have 2 Mutavaults, and if I draw another land, I'll be able to try that block twice, so potentially slowing down the opponent's Etched Champion clock with my Mutavaults, although I'd really rather this Ghost Quarter were not on the table right now. Alright, so Etched Champion on the battlefield. Cursecatcher comes in at the end of turn. AEther Vials go up to 2 and 1, and looks like I drew a Master of Waves, which is just terrible because, as usual, Affinity has the pedal to the metal, and they've got evasive threats with battle cry pumps and cranial plating buffs, and I've only got Mutavaults and an AEther Vial on 2 really right now. So since the opponent has the Ghost Quarter, I think I decide this turn that I can activate the Mutavault and attack. He almost certainly won't block with Etch Champion because he doesn't want to trade his 3-drop for my land. But if he did, I could even drop in a Lord of Atlantis and just eat the Etch Champion. But again, because of the Ghost Quarter and because I lack other lands right now, I don't need to leave Mutavault up as a blocker. So I think I'm going to activate it this turn just to try to get in a couple extra points of damage where I might not otherwise be able to later in the game. Cursecatcher is just going to sit here this turn. He cannot attack into the Etch Champion because Etch Champion does have Metalcraft online since the opponent has more than 3 artifacts, 3 or more artifacts, and I don't have Islandwalk going yet. So here's the Mutavault attacking. Opponent goes down to 18, and I think I'm just going to bounce his Signal Pest here. My other choices were just to bring in a Lord, but if the opponent drops on this Cranial Plating, he already has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 artifacts on the table, and when he puts out another Etch Champion with the Cranial Plating, the Etch Champion will be swinging for 7, and Signal Pest will make it 8, and Ornithopter would push another point of damage, and taking it all the way up to 9. So bouncing the Signal Pest here, well, Harbinger can't target the Etch Champion. That's important to point out. So bouncing the Signal Pest will just save a couple points of damage, and develop my board with more Merfolk. Now, I mentioned in the first game why we usually wait till the opponent's turn to use Harbinger. We can't do that in this case because once Signal Pest has been tapped and declared as an attacker, the Battle Cry trigger goes on the stack, and it'll resolve even if I bounce the Signal Pest with Harbinger at that point. So better to get the Signal Pest off the table while it's tapped on my turn than to wait for it to tap again on its next turn in order to not give the opponent access to the value of Battle Cry. So for their turn, they drew a Mox Opal, suboptimal, but it does contribute another artifact to the board for Cranial Plating. And the opponent's going to play out the Signal Pest again, and looks like they're just swinging with the Etch Champion. So if we do a quick artifact count, we see 6, including Darksteel Citadel. So opponent getting in for 8 here. Okay, so I untap. My AEther Vials will both go up. Actually, I want to get both of these Lords onto the table, but I also want to move my AEther Vials up. So I think I'm going to activate this AEther Vial with a trigger on the stack, and then let the trigger resolve. So it'll go up to 3, so Kira can come in next turn. Kira, not as necessary as it was in the last game, because the opponent is not attacking for evasive damage in the air. It's just attacking with protection from colors. So Kira is not going to be able to block this Etch Champion, so I don't really need to get her out onto the board right away. So I could take the AEther Vial up to 3 this turn and use it for Kira, but instead I'll be able, if I really want to take this AEther Vial up to 3 the following turn and this one up to 4 and get all my creatures onto the table. But given the way that things are going, I don't think I'm going to have that much time. So let's see how this ended up resolving. AEther Vial, going to bring out one of my Islandwalk Lords, and then both of them will tick up from 2 and 1 to 3 and 2. I drew a Reejerey, which is interesting because I could have put him into play instead of the Islandwalk Lord. Ultimately, I don't think the difference is very, very big at all. So I need to leave the Mutavault up to try to block his Etch Champion, because I think between the Ornithopter getting a buff from Signal Pest next turn and Etch Champion swinging for, with Signal Pest now, I think it's going to be 9. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So he's 8, plus the Signal Pest trigger would be 9. I think that would just be lethal next turn. So attacking here with my ground creatures, the colored ground creatures, because they can't block this guy anyway. So we do the math. It's 2, 2, and 3. So just 7. The opponent goes from, hold on, so he was at 18, I think. So it should be 3, 5, and 7. I think he only took 6. But I'll bring this guy in, and it's actually going to be 10 total. So, yeah, the opponent got it in the end. And I don't know if most Affinity lists run Ghost Quarter, or if the opponent brought this in from the sideboard or something, but extremely relevant in this matchup. He could have switched the cranial plating over to a flyer, and then if I activate Mutavault to block the Etch Champion, most of the damage would still be coming across with Ornithopter. With 6 artifacts, Ornithopter would be a 6/2, with a Signal Pest trigger would be a 7/2. Not enough to kill me though. So, very relevant this Ghost Quarter this game. Opponent's going to tap to get another artifact on the board, and Arcbound Ravager is particularly effective here because the opponent just wants to get extra damage in with evasion, and if I have some random way of interacting, he can always sacrifice things at instant speed to Ravager and then pile counters on top of whatever creature gets through. Although I should mention the Arcbound Ravager has kind of an inverse anti-synergy with cranial plating, because every artifact that you sacrifice takes points of power away from the artifacts that are being counted for cranial plating. So opponent just taps his guys sideways here. I'm going to attempt to activate Mutavault, hoping that the opponent forgets he has a Ghost Quarter. This guy's actually a very savvy opponent. This was actually the second match that we played. He just destroyed me in the first match, but I asked if we could play again, because I always love practicing against Affinity. Opponent Ghost Quarters. I finally get an island onto the board, but I'm already dead. So I scoop it up, and opponent takes game 2. Game 1, Merfolk. Game 2, Affinity, and we'll go to game 3 and see how this one went. Alright, so opening hands. 2 blue sources, AEther Vial. 2 Silvergills is fantastic. Islandwalk Lord, Cursecatcher. Snapkeep for me. On the opponent's side, we see he finally has some of that fast mana with the Springleaf Drums. 2 Inkmoth Nexus as lands, Arcbound Ravager as sort of a payoff card, Signal Pest for buffs, Etch Champion for evasion. Pretty keepable on the opponent's side as well, I think. I'll be on the play though, and we'll start with Island and AEther Vial. The opponent drew a Vault Scourge, which is a great turn 1 play. So there he is, get that lifelink effect on the table. AEther Vial goes to 1, and I draw into a Cursecatcher. Reveal Silvergill for Wanderwine Hub, cast Silvergill, reveal Cursecatcher. And I'm just going to play the Cursecatcher out now, since I've already revealed it, no surprises. And I drew a Wanderwine Hub off the Silvergill Adept. Looks like the opponent drew, what, another Arcbound Ravager. Plays Inkmoth Nexus, and what's going to happen here? He's going to get some of that fast mana onto the table. Plays a Springleaf Drum, and plays Signal Pest. Now Signal Pest, since it has Summoning Sickness, can't attack, but the opponent gets some utility out of it by using it to tap for Springleaf Drum. If a card has an effect with the word tap in it, when it says, for example, tap an untapped creature you control, if it doesn't actually have the tap symbol, it doesn't matter if the creature has Summoning Sickness. Another example of this is Heritage Druid in Elves. If you play another Elf, it doesn't matter that it has Summoning Sickness, it can still tap for Heritage Druid. Same thing with Springleaf Drum. So opponent, being very efficient here, plays another Springleaf Drum using that mana, and then is going to attack for 1 in the air with Vault Scourge, and the opponent gains 1 life. So now with access to 2 Springleaf Drums, we see the opponent will be able to generate 4 mana, but it will require him to tap all of his creatures. So even though it's fast mana, without a cranial plating, it's still a little bit clunky, a little bit slow. So I'll take AEther Vial up to 2. I draw Mutavault, which is pretty powerful. As I mentioned last game, it's pretty much our only blocker against Etch Champion. And, you know, it's an attacker who can get Islandwalk and get bigger and bigger with Lords. So, I am going to want to play this Mutavault. Many times I'll wait to make my land drop until I resolve any spells that will draw me cards, Silvergill in this case. But since I have a Cursecatcher in hand and I'm going to want to play that guy, or potentially leave up blue for Vapor Snag or something, should I draw it off the Silvergill, I'm going to cast Silvergill off of Mutavault and Wanderwine Hub, leaving AEther Vial up for Master of the Pearl Trident. In this way, I get to play my manland, which I want on the table as a potential attacker or blocker. I get to play my manland and also deploy all of my creatures. So Mutavault goes onto the table, and then I'm going to, as I mentioned, cast Silvergill using colorless and blue, revealing Master of the Pearl Trident, and drew another Silvergill Adept, which I'm never sad to see. Play my Cursecatcher, play my Lord, and it's time to start being the aggressive one. We can see here that being on the play is a big deal. The opponent is getting his game started, but we'll see if he was on the play. At this point in the game, he'd essentially have his board state that he's going to develop next turn. Instead, he's one turn behind. In aggro versus aggro matchups, being on the play is a huge advantage. And I just stole game one from him. He was on the play, but my surprise interaction with AEther Vial, with Harbinger, and with Kira allowed me to steal game one. The opponent took game two on the play, and now with me on the play, I'm absolutely on the front foot. So the opponent didn't draw any more mana. So as I was mentioning last turn, he only has his 2 lands and the 2 Springleaf Drums. So it makes things a little bit difficult to get out onto the table. The opponent's going to play an Arcbound Ravager, and thought about it for a while. He has to choose here between another Arcbound Ravager and a Steel Overseer. Doesn't have mana yet for Etched Champion. Or he does, but then he'd only be able to play 1 creature. Alright. So makes a smart play, I think. Taps the Signal Pest, even though it could potentially attack, because Signal Pest doesn't do damage by itself, leaving up Arcbound Ravagers as potential blockers who can get bigger by sacrificing things. But if we look at his board state at this point, if he chooses to sacrifice anything to Arcbound Ravagers, he's going to be losing creatures or mana, and he really needs both of those things right now. If he sacrifices these 2 to this Arcbound and these 2 to this Arcbound, they would just become 3/3s, and my guys are already in that range. So feeling pretty good about this board state. We have an AEther Vial, we have a Silvergill who can draw me a card, and I'm going to get my draw for the turn. Hit another Mutavault. So I think since I'm going to attack with the Mutavault this turn, it is correct to use the AEther Vial here to play my only creature and then see what I draw. So I drew an Islandwalk Lord, which is great because I can play my second Mutavault, use 2 blue to play that Lord, and then activate an attack with the Mutavault, and that's actually a ton of damage. So let me activate the Mutavault, and then just count it all up. So we have 3 4-power creatures, Mutavault and 2 Silvergills, so that's 4, 4, 4, and then 3 3s. So 4 times 3 and 3 times 3, so it's 12 plus 9, so it's 21. It's a lot of damage, and at this point, the kind of math that the opponent is doing is how do I live this turn math, right? And so the easiest way to do that is just to block the 2 biggest creatures. So if he blocks 2 of my 4-power creatures, he would still be taking 3, 3, 3, and 4, which is 13. He would go down to 1, which would let him live another turn, but he certainly couldn't get me down from 19 to 0 next turn. A potential line with Arcbound Ravagers is always to dump a whole bunch of counters onto an Inkmoth Nexus and just win with Infect. But with no access to mana right now, he can't even activate an Inkmoth. So if he had 1 more land right now, for example, he could block 2 of my 4-power attackers with the Arcbound Ravagers, sack everything onto a Ravager. So sack these 4 things, So there would be 5 counters on this Ravager, and then I guess sack this Ravager onto him, and then he would have 6 counters, and then activate an Inkmoth Nexus, and then dump all 6 counters onto him. Next turn, he'd be able to attack for 7 Infect, and probably couldn't get there anyway, but it's a line that he had to have at least, been aware of. So at this point, if he blocks the 2 4 power, he can sack a bunch of stuff and try to trade, but then he's left pretty much with an empty board. He could chump block, but then he's just losing his 2 powerful creatures, and I still have a ton of power on the board, and so the opponent, didn't have a lot of options here. I have a ton of pressure, and this is actually turn 4, I believe. A very explosive game for Merfolk. I got very fortunate drawing this extra Lord off the Silvergill. If I did not have this extra Lord and was just swinging instead for 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, and 2, it would be 15, which is lethal, but the opponent could certainly have an easier time dealing with 2 2s and 3 3s instead of 4 4s and 3 3s. So in the end, the opponent scooped it up, and we were able to get there. We didn't see a single Hurkyl's Recall in that entire match. I assure you, I did sideboard them in. Game 1 was pretty miraculous. You should always play to your outs, and don't assume that the opponent understands what you have in hand. I had sort of a surprise Harbinger and a surprise Kira, and keeping AEther Vial up for those won me the game. And then game 2, the opponent just did what Affinity does, and game 3, Merfolk did what Merfolk does. So a very nice match against one of our most difficult opponents. Please, as always, share your thoughts. If you have any questions, let me know. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thanks very much.